In the video that I published last video, the message was sometimes SharePoint built-in feature can do things a lot better than Power Automate workflows. And regardless of how much people liked that video, Power Automate was pissed. The message was, how dare you compare a modern Power Automate technology with a Stone Age technology like SharePoint? Well, yes, but I had to explain it. Regardless, to keep my Power Automate engine happy, today I'm publishing a video on YouTube, and I'm giving you an example that there are things that Power Automate can do better. Not inside SharePoint, but also comparing it with SharePoint REST API. Let's see this example, and I hope you will enjoy this video as much as I did creating it. Let's start with problem definition. We have a solution that some developers are building in an unknown platform. It's not Microsoft, it's some weirdo thing like, I don't know, Google, Apple, iOS, whatever, nothing standard. They want to create a folder inside SharePoint library based on some certain actions. So inside SharePoint, we have a library called Documents, and once in a while, this solution should be able to create a folder inside this library. Great. Because we don't know what it is, and we don't know if this guy understands SharePoint language, well, the standard communication method these days is going to be a REST API. That's a language, that's a communication protocol that the entire solar system understands. Even something around 75 to 80% of the entire galaxy can communicate with REST API. So it's wise to look for or build a REST API that facilitates this communication and does the job. But hold on, SharePoint has its own REST API. So naturally, I go to Google and start searching for create folder, SharePoint REST API. And right on the top of the list, we have working with folders and files with REST. Fantastic. Let me just click on this. And probably if I scroll down, I can find a way that I can create a folder. Great. The following example shows how to create a folder. Fantastic. The method is post as expected. Site URL, API, web folders. Great. This is the URL, authorization bearer, access token. What the heck is this access token? Well, it should be somewhere in the beginning. Let's go for basic operations. Probably we can find access token. Access token. Yes, access token. Oops. It's for auth access token. Great, great, great. For more information on how to obtain an access token, see context token auth flow for SharePoint add-ins. Well, yeah, we scroll down and it tells us that we need to create a flow that does, this is too much. So we have to create a flow, and if you're supposed to create a flow just to make a call to this API, why do we need this API again? From inside flow, we can go there and create our folder. So let me put it this way. Instead of putting all these complexities together and talk to these strange guys that, hey, you know what? This is the flow that we have. You need to call this one. It gives you a token. Forget about it. You just tell them that this is the scenario, and they're going to tell you, you know what? Just give us a post REST API that accepts a folder name and an API key. Give us that static API key. We know how to work with that. So all of a sudden, things change. Instead of looking for the SharePoint REST API, we are trying to create our own REST API using Power Automate to create the folder. Let's see how we can do this one. I go to flow.microsoft.com and I click on Create. Here, if I scroll up, I can click on Instant Cloud Flow. It's an instant flow because some action should take place and directly calls the flow. So I create a flow called Create Folder for Unknown Solution. A terrible name. And if I scroll down, probably I will find when an HTTP request is received. Let me just click on this guy and I click on Create. Now, before we actually start working with this, let's decide on the messages that we want to exchange between that unknown solution and the REST API that we are going to create. In general, we need to create a REST API using Power Automate flow. We test the REST API using Postman. Then we create the requested folder using the REST API flow that we just created. And finally, we test it in Postman and give it to those guys. The messages that we want to exchange, the request is going to look like this. Just simple JSON message, which contains folder name and the API key. So this is our message. If I come here, it's asking me for a sample data to generate a JSON schema because it needs to know what kind of format we are going to receive as our JSON message. So I click on this guy and I just paste the message here. You could simply type it in, just provide the folder name, whatever the dummy value, because these are not the actual values, it's just a sample, so that Flow can understand what kind of message or what kind of request it can expect. So I click on Done. Just make sure you click on Advanced Options and pick the right method. You can create this API with any method, but post basically means that you want to add something, you want to create something. But regardless, this is just an agreement. You can create a get method that goes there and create post. Although it looks weird and everybody else is trying to use this get method to create a folder, we'll say, oh, hold on a second. What were those guys thinking? But it does the job. So because we are creating an item or we are creating a folder, we are using the post method. The REST API is not created yet. It is created right after we save it. At the moment, we cannot save it because it just has a trigger. It doesn't have any action. And as you probably know, you cannot save a flow that doesn't do anything. Let's go straight to the return values. The return schema is going to be just one message. It's going to tell you either the folder is successfully created or it says invalid API key. So basically the requester sent a wrong key. So he or she or it is not authorized. I really don't know the right pronoun for this guy, but this is the caller. This app, this solution, this service should produce that key so that REST API will authorize the folder creation. So I pick one of these messages and I bring it back to Power Automate. Inside Power Automate, I click on New Step and I want to create a response. So I look for request and I create a response for the request. If it is success, the status code is going to be 200. In general, when we create REST API, 200, 201, 202, whatever that is within the 200 range means success. 400 means client error, 500 means server error. These are just standard way that we define the status code. Body, I still don't have the body, but before I add the body here, I need to create a schema for this guy. So I click on Advanced Option. So it says response body JSON schema. I generate it from the sample, and the sample is this value or this value. So message and whatever that is in front of it, it has only one property. So I bring it back here and I just stick this guy here. And whatever it says, it doesn't matter. I click on Done because it's just a matter of creating the schema. It's just the format of that JSON message. But on success, that the status code 200 defines success, I need to provide this message. On success, it shouldn't say invalid API key. It should say folder successfully created, and we are good. Now we can create this REST API. So let me click on Save, and as you press Save, it generates the URL for this guy. Bingo! It generated the URL, and this is the URL we can pass it to Postman to call this REST API. At the moment, it doesn't do anything. Let me just get a copy of this URL, and we are inside Postman. I click on Post. You need to pick the matching method. I just paste the URL here and everything is good. The only thing that I need is just a body for this request. Body is going to be raw, and I say it's not text, it's a JSON content that I want to pass to this REST API. And the message that we want to pass is going to be something like this. So I copy this guy and stick it here. Now let's call it and see if it works. I click on Send and see what kind of message we get. Great. It worked and it returned a message, folder successfully created. I am happy. All right. Now let's validate the API key. So I go back to my flow. right after the call is received, I want to put a condition. I click on this guy and I say, if the value that I receive as API key from the REST API, if it is equal to the value 123456, 123456, then this is going to be the response. Otherwise, request, and I add another response. That body is going to be exactly like that. I have the schema already generated on this side, so I can simply copy this schema and stick it here for the schema. I don't need to recreate it. And for the body, I just say message, and it's going to be invalid API key. Of course, because it's a server error, the status code should sit within the range of 500. So I just put 500 for this one. Great. Let's save it and see if it really works. So if the API key is equal to 123456, it should say success. Otherwise, it should say invalid API key. It's saved, so let's go back to my Postman. At the moment, the API key is 123456. Let's click on send. And it says invalid API key. Hold on a sec. What did we miss? The condition that we have. Oops. Okay, so in general, when something looks like a number, Power Automate assumes that it's a number unless you specifically say it's a string. So if I enclose it in double quote, it's good. Or if you really want to do it properly, you can simply click on expression and put string and pass it inside the string function, and you press OK. Now it compares the actual string with the string, and we are good. Let me just save it and test it again. Back to Postman, and this time if I say send, it says folder successfully created. And if I put a different key, for example, I add a 7 in the end, I click on send, it says invalid key. Perfect. So we created and tested our REST API with two paths, one with valid API key, the other one with invalid. So when it is valid, we need to create a folder, which is the easy job. I just come back here and I can add something before this response, because you cannot directly add before response. I can click on add an action and I can say create folder. Let's see if I can find it. Yes, SharePoint, create new folder. I can click on this guy. Now, because this guy should be before response, you need to use drag and drop and bring one after the other. So we create a folder and then we return the response. I go to the SharePoint site, I copy the URL, I bring it back here, and I click on enter custom value, and I just stick the URL here. Just give it a few seconds. It's smart enough to trim it. Perfect. So it gives me the pure site URL. I can pick the library that I want, which is documents, and the folder that I want to create in that library is going to be the folder name that comes from the REST API. Now, if I save this, if the API key is valid, it should create the folder for us. Let's give it a shot and see how it works. I go back to my Postman and everything is good. I just need to correct the API key and I click on send. Let's see what it gives us. Folder successfully created. Let's see if this guy is telling the truth. I go back to SharePoint, I refresh the screen, and my folder test is created. Let's call it again, and I click on send. Again, it says the same thing. Let's refresh this guy, and you see the folder is there. Create folder does not throw error. So create folder, if the folder is already there, it just ignores it and says, okay, the folder is there, I did my job. If you really want to validate and customize this message in a way that it says folder already exists or it says folder successfully created, we need to check the existence of this folder inside this library before we move on. And if you really want to know that, put it in the comments section and I will tell you how you can write the OData query to see if the folder exists in another video. So for now, we created a REST API that can simply go to SharePoint, create a folder, and that API is accessible to anything without any authentication, and it only requires an API key that we just type it in. And I think in this scenario, it is a lot easier than dealing with the SharePoint REST API directly, getting the access token, and dealing with the other side of the story. And before I end this video, for the ones that they are not very experienced with the REST API, I want to have a brief explanation about method and status code. When we are creating a REST API or a web API, there are multiple methods that we can use to create these methods. They are all suggestive of the function of that API. It doesn't mean it has to do this. We usually set the method as get when we want to retrieve some information. Again, it doesn't mean that get method cannot create. At the end, whatever you put in that code or you put in that flow that is exposed as a REST API will do the job. Get is just suggestive that the client who is making the call to this API is expecting to get something, not to go there and change something. Post at the same time looks into creating a new record, new file, new folder. And that's why for this API that we built, we used post method. Put is there to update, and delete, the name says it all. There are a lot more methods that if you look into your Postman, you will see here. But these 4 methods are the ones that are most commonly used. If you use the wrong method for the web API that you built, it's not the end of the world. It's not going to break the functionality as long as this method in your client and this method on your trigger match, the call is successful and everything goes well. But it's a poor practice when you're creating a web API. Now let's look into the status. A status code 200, as I mentioned, it typically means it's a successful call. We want to see 200 or 201, 202 or whatever. So 200 range is a good news for us. At the same time, to give you an overview of these status codes, you may want to look into this slide. 100 range is informational. Typically, 200 is success, 300 is redirection, 400, whatever, is client error, means that the call failed because client didn't do something right. Server error is 500, means that the call was successful, but something happened on the server, so it didn't produce the result that it was supposed to do. Now, when we look into our flow, you see the client provides the wrong API key, and we return 500. Logically, 500 is on the server side, while the problem is with our client. Obviously, the wrong code, but still our solution works. Again, these status codes are suggestive and they are not enforce the functionality or the final result of a REST API. So now we know that this 500 should be in the 400 range. And if you want to be a little bit more specific, there is another chart of the 400 client error that says 400 means bad request, 401 means the call is unauthorized, and this is exactly our case. So the best choice for the status code of wrong API key is going to be 401. And now it follows the traditions of the status code, and the right status code is applied for this REST API. And now, if these are the things you want to learn, and in general you want to learn how to call a REST API, how to create a REST API using Microsoft Power Automate, I have a course on Udemy called Working with Web APIs in Microsoft Power Automate MS Flow. And the best part is that this course is for not developers. And next thing is, you guessed it, I have a free course coupon. It is valid only for 5 days. So rush if you want to take advantage of this course and add to your web API knowledge using Power Automate. The link to the course is in the video description. Let me guess, probably some of you are going to come to me and say, Ali, this is not the best practice. We can do this, and that. Well, yes, this is not the best practice. And I cannot say it's the worst practice. And I really don't know even what is the best practice in this case, because I personally do not believe in best practice. To me, the best practice is a solution that considers everything, including the availability, the expertise that we have in-house, the capability of support, and the time to delivery. And all these things contribute to a solution, not just something that big boys like Microsoft, Oracle, Apple, IBM, and all those things, they tell us as best practice. No, that's not the case. We are the consultants, and we have to take the ownership of our solution, considering whatever that we have in our environment, not based on what the big players recommend. Have a good day, and I'll see you in the next video.